Hey guys, Richard Holder here, and welcome to the channel. What is your favorite Ford motor? Is it a Coyote? Maybe a Shelby? You know, for me, I like the 0304 Cobra motor. All hail the Terminator. In this video, we're going to take a look at modifications I made to the 0304 Cobra crate motor. So here's a question for you. Did the factory motor really only make 370 horsepower? Well, you're in luck. I got a brand new 0304 Cobra crate motor, took it out of the crate, installed it up on the dyno. I ran it with all the accessories, ran it with the stock exhaust manifolds. We even ran it with a stock tune. So what do you think? Did it only make 370? How about no? We also did a bunch of modifications to it. We put a throttle body on it, we put headers on it, and of course, we added boost. Let's check it out. I'm not sure I've ever been quite as excited as I was about getting this particular crate motor from the guys at Ford Racing. It was an 0304 Cobra crate motor, and we were very excited because we knew the potential of this motor. I mean, this thing was very underrated by Ford. They rated it at 370 horsepower, and as we'll see by the dyno session, basically we took this motor out of the crate, stuck it up on the dyno, we hooked exhaust to the factory exhaust manifolds, we ran it with everything stock. Now, for the guys who don't know, this motor came as, had Ford's crank, Ford's rods, it had 8.5-to-1 blower-friendly pistons, it had very good 4-valve heads, and had decent camshafts in it. It was already equipped with a factory M122 Eaton supercharger and an air-to-water intercooler, and this thing was running around beating up on Camaros all the time, because these things worked out very well. And as good as they were stock, and we're going to see how good, they were even better as a basis for further upgrades, because any sort of factory like supercharged application or turbocharged application is basically just a license to steal, because you can turn these things up and make a lot more power. And the basic engine of this 0304 Cobra motor, this thing had a lot to offer, and we would take this thing way into the 4-digit realm eventually. But let's start out with what we did right when we got this motor and the major or the minor modifications that we made to this thing in our first dyno session. So as I said, what we did was we put this thing up on the dyno and ran it the way that it came from Ford. We hooked up the air-to-water intercooler, we were running dyno water through it, we ran it with the factory crank and blower pulleys, we ran it with a factory throttle body. All we had to do obviously was hook up our throttle linkage. We controlled the air, fuel, and timing with a fast XFI management system so we could optimize this. And the first thing we did, we found out what the factory tune was at wide open throttle running in this range from 3,000 to 6,500, and we programmed that factory tune into here. We got our tune from the guys over at Kenny Bell, and they showed us exactly what the timing curve was at each RPM and this boost level and all that. So we could put that into our fast because we wanted to start out the way that this thing basically came from the factory. So that's exactly what we did. So running this motor just right out of the crate with the stock exhaust manifolds, the stock boost, we even had the accessories on it. We did not have the usual electric water pump that we run because this thing came with all of the accessories on. So run in this manner, this 03 Cobra motor rated at 375 horsepower actually made 483 horsepower. Peak torque checked in at 427, and as you can see from a torque curve standpoint, this thing made over 400 foot-pounds from our load in at 3,000 RPM all the way out to 6,300 RPM. But naturally, we didn't stop there. We did all the modifications that a regular guy would do. The first thing is that we changed the tune on this. So the guys from Kenny Bell showed us what tune that they offered back in the day. And this is what happened. Basically, you're adding timing. We went up to about 23 degrees. And so adding timing, especially down low, had a big change in the power output. The factory timing was pretty good up at the top, so we didn't have big changes there. But we picked up as much as, you know, we saw a difference between 420 foot-pounds to 456 foot-pounds. So big changes down in the lower RPM range. And that's what happened running our motor stock and then with a tune. So now let's take a look and see what happened when we ran other upgrades, like we're going to start off with a throttle body and a set of long tube headers. After optimizing the tune on our 03 Cobra crate motor, it was time to do some modifications. So what we wanted to do, eventually, obviously, we would be turning up the boost as everybody did on these Cobra motors. But before we did that, we wanted to actually improve the airflow into and out of the motor. So we actually started our modification list with a set of long tube headers. These were 1 5/8 Flowtech headers from the guys over at Hooker. And here's what happened when we installed the headers. We replaced the factory exhaust manifolds and basically collector extensions or exhaust with the long tube headers. And we also had collector extensions on the long tube headers. Again, 1 5/8 Flowtech headers. And you can see we did improve the power output. The peak power jumped up to right at 500 horsepower. Peak torque was up to 460 foot-pounds. And you can see we gained torque down low, down in the 3,000, 3,100 RPM, and we gained power out at the top. The other interesting thing is this actually dropped boost slightly when we put the headers on. So we're flowing better through the motor, so that means the boost pressure from running the blower at the same speed is actually going to come down a little bit. So those two things go together. So the next test that we ran, now that we're getting all of our exhaust and getting that boost out of the motor, let's try to work on getting more in. So we replaced the factory inlet into the blower and throttle body with an AccuFab elbow and throttle body, a big single blade. Here's what happened when we did the throttle body and inlet upgrade. We picked up a little bit, not a ton, 505 horsepower, and through most of the lower RPM range, it was the same. Now, we have seen bigger gains from these, and this is important to note when you're running any kind of supercharged motor. The more airflow that you're trying to process with the blower, the more important these things become, especially on the inlet side. So were we to do this test, were we to add this throttle body at a much higher boost level and flow level, the gains offered by the throttle body, where the factory stuff becomes more restrictive, would get even greater. So we would have more of a gain. We've seen 15 or 20 from this throttle body and elbow or inlet on these blowers at very high boost levels. So again, you know, you're going to get more when the motor needs more airflow and you can supply it, so the gains will be greater. So now let's take a look and see what happened when we started off with adding more boost by changing pulleys. After improving the inlet and outlet of our supercharged motor, obviously it was time to turn up the boost. So that's exactly what we did. In order to turn up the boost on our M112 Eaton supercharger, what we did was installed one of the Dowlier boost pulley systems. And what that does is basically it replaces the factory non-removable pulley on the Eaton supercharger with a hub, and then with the hub all you have to do is bolt on whatever size pulley that you want. So we replaced the factory pulley first off with a 3.2-inch blower pulley from the Dowlier boost setup. And here's what happened when we increased the boost pressure. And as you can see, raising the boost improved the power not just at the peak, but basically everywhere. And that's one of the big gains that we get from improving the boost on a boosted application, whether it's turbocharged or supercharged. The added boost improves power basically everywhere, and we see that. So peak power was up, as we expected, up to 530 horsepower. Peak torque was up to 506 foot-pounds, and we had a nice consistent gain all the way across, although it started to taper just a little bit at the top, and we would actually see that happen even more once we installed the next pulley from the guys at South Florida. So here is what happened. We replaced the 3.2-inch blower pulley with a 2.93-inch blower pulley. And again, we got big gains in torque. We were up to 550 foot-pounds, but the power peak was only up to 538 horsepower because, again, our power curve just started falling off, and we suspect that this was belt slippage from this setup, the way that and you can kind of take a look, I'll show you here. We even tried to move the alternator pulley slightly to get more tension on the belt, but I think that we were running into belt slippage. Just remember, this was all the way back in 2004, so, you know, it would have been nice to have some super grip pulleys or those kinds of things, but that just wasn't, we didn't have that for this dyno test. And this would get even more aggravated once we installed the final upgrade, which was more boost, but rather than go down in blower pulley size, because you get to a point where there's just not enough belt wrap on the blower pulley, so it's going to be more prone to slippage. So what we did was increase the size of the crank pulley, again with the Dowlier boost setup from South Florida pulley headquarters, I think. So here is our crank pulley upgrade. And again, we picked up boost, a little bit of boost, and we picked up power. Our torque peak goes up to 565 foot-pounds, but we just didn't get the consistent gains all the way through. It started falling off, and again, I'm fairly sure that this is probably belt slippage, so we could get more power. I know guys have made 600 horsepower at the flywheel with these combinations if you can get everything right on it, if you can get the boost, if you can get the belt slippage away from it. the blower will support that, especially when guys later on would get into porting these blowers. The inlet system was more than enough there. Obviously, this thing would benefit from camshafts and port heads and those kinds of things, and we would do that later on in this motor. In addition to running all the different forms of force induction, and that video is up, we'd run turbos on this thing, and we'd put a couple of, or a quartet of comp cams in this thing later on. But now let's take a look at the boost curves associated with what we did here on these simple upgrades. Now that we've taken a look at the changes in power associated with the upgrades we made to our 0304 Cobra crate motor, let's take a look at what happened with the boost pressure when we made these same changes. So this is the boost curve of our bone stock motor as we put it up on the dyno with the stock exhaust manifolds, the stock throttle body, stock air intake, run with the stock tune. Because the interesting thing is when we changed the tune, it actually changed the boost pressure, which is interesting. So here is our stock run. And here's what happened after we basically added timing. We did trim the air fuel a little bit. We went from, it was as high as, or as rich as 10.8 out at the top, and we tuned that a little bit, running it more like 11.5 to 1. But it's interesting that the boost pressure went up slightly when we changed our tune. And again, the scale here is not very much. So this looks like a big difference, but it's actually not. It's only 0.2 of a pound of boost. So it's basically nothing. But here's what happened when we installed the long tube headers. So the long tube headers now are in red. The boost dropped. As I said, the boost dropped when we improved the exhaust flow out of the motor. We're processing more air. The blower is still spinning the same. So the boost pressure actually went down when we installed the headers, which is what you want. You want to make more power with less boost. So now when we address the inlet side of all of this and put the AccuFab throttle body and the inlet system on the blower, here's what happened, and that's in red. The boost went up slightly, and this correlates with what we saw on the dyno. It picked up more power out of the top. It had a little bit more boost at the top. So all of those things go together. But we really didn't see a big change in power until we changed our pulley. So when we put our Dollier boost pulley setup on here and installed the 3.2 pulley, you can kind of see big change in boost. That jumped it all the way up to 10.9 pounds at the peak. And you can see, if you look at this, the peak boost was actually in the middle of the RPM range, and then the boost would fall off. And we would see this on all of the different boost ranges here. We saw this on the factory one. It was exactly like that. So we know that there was no belt slippage there. We saw that on all the subsequent runs with the tune, with the headers, and with the throttle body. So they're all kind of mimicking the same shape. Here's what happened when we went from the 3.2 to the 2.9. Boost was up quite a bit, all the way up to a peak of 13.3, and we're still seeing the same thing. The peak boost is in the middle of the RPM range, and then it's falling off at the top a little bit more dramatically with that pulley. As we said, I think we're starting to see some belt slippage there. And then when we installed our final change, which was the bigger crank pulley, we saw another change in boost, this time to 14.5 pounds. So we went up about a pound and a half there, going on the big crank pulley. But again, we're seeing the boost fall off dramatically out here at the top with probably belt slippage. So now that we've made all these modifications to our 03 Cobra motor, well, let's get to our conclusion. Okay guys, what did we learn from this little adventure running the modifications on our 0304 Cobra crate motor from the guys at Ford Racing? There were two reasons I really like the Terminator motor. One, for what it is. It was underrated by the factory. It obviously made more than 370 horsepower, just as any Camaro owner from back in the day. And I really like the way that these motors sounded. They sounded great at wide open throttle. But as much as I like them for what they were, I like them for what they could be. Any factory production supercharged or turbocharged motor, any factory forced induction motor has a ton of potential built right into it. That means we can take our 370 horsepower and probably make well over 1,000 horsepower. We did that with this motor using the stock short block and the stock cylinder head. Just put a cam in it, add boost from turbos, and away you go. You can make a ton of power. Good what they are, even better what they can be. I'm Richard Holder. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. More and more testing coming up.